Here to tell us about this amazing study, please direct your attention to the presentation stage as once again we welcome Dr. Leslie Saxon, and joining her is Dr. Mona Sobhani, Director of Research for the USC Center for Body Computing, and Brooks Dipaula, Business Development Coordinator for the USC Center for Body Computing. Let's welcome them.
We are really honored to present the preliminary results of our studies down with Reconnaissance Training Company at Camp Pendleton. And I just have to mention how indebted we are to the people that have helped us get down there and learn their needs, including Clark Lethine from ICT, who's a Marine Colonel, as well as the just incredible engagements we had in the Reconnaissance Training Company with a number of people, but primarily Major Zuber and Captain Pierce, who's here. And then I need to thank our team of brilliant neuroscientists, Mona Sobhani and Glenn Fox, and Brooks actually had to go live at Pendleton for 4 months and kind of embedded there to make this study go. So we didn't know if you'd come back, but welcome back. So we're really delighted to present this first data from our study entitled Performance Quantified, Predicting Outcomes in Reconnaissance Training. When we first got introduced to the training school and we were doing performance studies in athletes, and we learned about this special group of warfighters, Reconnaissance Marines, and they kind of explained to us over time some of their unique challenges. And these were very experienced instructors who'd been Reconnaissance Marines. Many of them had seen a lot of battle and trying to just pull more trainees through the recon pipeline. And in stepping back and looking at the challenges they had and the knowledge they knew, we thought, how can we add value? Because we were constantly being reminded by Clark Lethine to have a so what factor to our research. So what we thought we'd do is take an attempt during a very rigorous, austere kind of training environment to identify continuously key physical, physiologic, behavioral, and psychological traits of a successful versus an unsuccessful reconnaissance Marine during training. And in doing so, start to evolve the thoughts that would allow us to follow these groups over time, to report on their performance at sort of every level of, to themselves, the individual, and then at every level of command. It's a very daunting challenge. And the more we thought about it, and the more we talked to these instructors, the more we realized what I actually talk about a lot in medical training. It's just not the same trainee as it was, say, when I trained or others. It's an individual who's very married to their digital life is as compelling emotionally and in many ways for them as their real life. They're on their smartphone 200 times a day. How do we leverage that within the training? So that was another one of our challenges, and how do we use this kind of warfighter community to leverage their social networks and connections and use wearable sensors, all the while not getting in anybody's way? And how do we, most importantly, maintain the rigor of recon training to increase graduation rates without degrading standards? As I understood it, and we've come to understand it, in many of these areas, they know they train an amazing reconnaissance Marine who can fight for years, but they need to pull more through, but they cannot degrade the standard. Very, very big challenge. We have the same thing in medical training. So reconnaissance Marines, there are only 1,000 active reconnaissance Marines in the country. They need more. Each year they take in about 1,000 and they graduate 200 plus. And let me just show you a short video on what it's like to be a Recon Marine.
Before large forces hit the combat zone, small precision-trained teams of Recon Marines sneak in first to scope out the battlefield.
They locate the enemy, they paint a picture of what the battlefield looks like to let the commanders know, hey, this is the proper way to employ your forces.
The Marines only send their best.
These guys are pretty hard. These are hard guys. They get to do the coolest missions, you know, all the high-speed stuff, the dangerous stuff, so I aspire to be one of them.
Hold it!
The grueling 12-week basic recon course primes men for the mind-blowing demands of the Recon Marines job.
Bear crawl, let's move!
Get off your knees! Get off your knees!
Sucks.
Only the strongest Marines volunteer for recon training.
To truly understand what it is to be a Recon Marine, you have to endure what this school has to offer.
Nearly half won't make it.
Get lower!
You will not continue with this training.
So the other thing that's kind of remarkable, and some of the special operations warfighters have recently reminded me of this, about this training course, is it's pretty condensed, as I understand, compared to, say, a SEAL training or something else. So the phases of this, a guy will land on the base and want to go through, or be elect to go through recon training, and he'll be in something called Marines awaiting reconnaissance training. So whenever he lands there, he gets into kind of think about it as an advanced kind of pre-Marine fitness class for the exact standards they'll be measuring in training. Then they go into a basic reconnaissance primer course. That's an intense 25-day Monday through Friday training course where they have a lot of attrition, up to 60%. Then they go into a longer phase where they actually learn some of the duties of becoming a Recon Marine. Then they go off to training schools. So the majority of the attrition is actually in that first phase. And the training that they actually go through in that basic reconnaissance primer course is there's a fair amount of stuff on land, and then there are a bunch of things in the pool, and those are really, this is not your college water polo game. This is like really intense set of skills that you need to have to keep yourself up in the water and handle a weapon and a million people trying to distract you, to start to understand if these guys have what it takes to work in a very complex environment. So we got a kind of a deep appreciation of what all that is and how this all works. And we thought a lot about what to use. And we decided to collaborate with best-in-breed internet and tech companies. We talked to a lot of people. We knew we had to do continuous assessments because these guys already have a feeling of who's going to quit or not. They know what their standards are, how they're doing, and the stuff they usually measure. But we needed to collect 24/7 to gather insights. And we also were dealing with this fact of the digital native. And so we ultimately decided that we wanted to use iPhones and Apple Watches, their capabilities at the time, to fully leverage those. And we realized that we had to work with a developer. We worked with a developer called Thread that was a great partner to develop a very specific reconnaissance trainee Marine app so that we could reach these young trainees all the time in a confidential way and really understand what was going on. Apple had a product stack that was also kind of unique in the world because we'd been using, they have software that allows you to consent people over an application, so we checked that box, pretty cyber secure. We also realized we could go with their stack, meaning that as we added sensors, hemoglobin, O2 sat, blood pressure, whatever we want, we could, as we evolve this platform, pull all that into the app, pull all this physiologic data on guys or behavioral data. We could assess their personality traits and profiles and their behavior every day using validated surveys. Mona, do you want to say something about how we decided to characterize their baseline personality versus how they felt moment to moment?
Yeah, so absolutely. So we wanted to measure their baseline personal characteristics, so things like personality and the way that they approach and interact with people on a daily basis, how they approach life. So we gave them a battery of behavioral surveys, those classic personality things, and some other ones that we thought would be most relevant to this subject base, the Marines, so things like grit, ego, resilience, things like that. So we didn't know exactly which ones would be the most informative. For this first one, we used a lot of different assessments. And then in addition to that, that's the basic, very stable personality assessment, we wanted to know on a day-to-day basis how they're approaching, how they feel as they're going through this training. So we had daily surveys that would assess how they felt physically, how they felt emotionally, if they felt they had enough to eat, to drink, etc. So we're getting basic just their personality, and then as well a day-to-day measurement.
And there were some preconceived notions that maybe they weren't getting enough, they're burning a lot of calories, maybe they weren't eating or drinking enough. They're not spoon-fed, these guys, to say the least. So, how were they accessing nutrition, adequate hydration? The other thing that was interesting about this Apple stack is we wanted to build toward where we had everybody on the platform so that the instructors in real time on an iPad, even with nav, could see a guy in the ocean. Or we wanted to build all that out. And that's why we stuck with this stack. And we wanted to try to understand from the instructors what they thought the major reasons were. And then we incorporated some of those solutions and assessments into the app. And the instructors were, I can't overemphasize the importance of doing this work and really understanding the need set of the group you're working with. So the instructors had a lot of input into this. Remember, we couldn't disrupt their culture of training. So, we had to have a lot of conversations around this. That's why it took 2 years. So we developed the app. And then just quickly, you need to understand how and why these guys drop out. So there's something called a DOR that accounts for the majority of things. And this is voluntarily pulling yourself out of training. As the instructors would say, they can quit on themselves. And that's it, they're done. A medical is typically an instructor wants to pull a guy out for some medical assessment. He's noticing things. A safety is a little bit of the same thing. Someone does something that is considered unsafe and not appropriate, could endanger someone, they're pulled out. And then performance, which you would think would be the number one thing, is the least amount of reasons for drops, and that's just they didn't meet a standard that they're testing against. So we're going to report the results of our first BRPC class lasting 25 days, 44 guys, and these are the parts of the country that they came from. Pretty representative, a lot of, I guess, most located around the coast. Their average age was 22, height, weight, most of them were single, and I think this is fairly typical. The majority were enlisted, and there were 26% were officers. In this particular class, they were, majority, I believe, were Navy corpsmen. And then we're sort of interested in kind of the changing demographic. Are guys really hunting less with their dads? Are they less athletic? Are they softer? Are they whatever? So we just kind of looked at high school sports because we had that. And a full 38% of them had not played a high school sport. So if that's indicative. And what we did was, this is a voluntary study. We had human subject approval at our university and through the Marines at Quantico. We have had our stuff on and supported this study in 152 Marines over the entirety of the training course. We have 3 basics and 1 full course. And we have some mission work from that, which I think mission training will be really interesting because that's going to give us insights into how to operationalize this ultimately. So we sat these guys into class. They're very busy training day 1, and most of them volunteered, and we rocked and rolled. And then Brooks moved down there. And Brooks, can you talk a little bit about this culture of kids? It's pretty important. There's a big life event for them, right?
Yeah, definitely. The group that we work with specifically, it comes from all walks of life. You've got guys that came from college, guys that enlisted themselves, and they're all very motivated and trying to become a Recon Marine. That is their sole purpose. This isn't people joining for just getting out and not getting a job initially, but they're extremely motivated to reach that next level from BRPC to BRC and eventually becoming an enlisted Recon Marine.
And I would say that their relationship with their instructors is a very intense one that I came to have more and more appreciation for because they have a ton of respect for these guys, and they control their fate. So of the class, over the 25 days, we did have a significant number of withdrawals. We had 48% of people didn't make it, and most of those were DORs. The Marines knew that. They knew what their drops data were. And most of them dropped equally between the land exercises and the pool. We had some for safety, as I mentioned, medical, and performance. So if you look at one of the things that was clear as we looked at some of the preliminary data was it seemed that like the time in the military predicted whether you'd make it through or not. And in general, that was true, but not only in the sense that of the drops, very few of them were seasoned Marines or had been in the Marine Corps longer than the mean time, which was 21 months. But we did have drops of seasoned Marines for other reasons. If you look at the things that they were already collecting, their standards, their physical profile, pull-ups didn't really predict much. Safeties tended to be less fit, but in general, pull-ups were not predictive of who was going to drop. So that standard didn't seem to ferret people out. They do a 3-mile run. This was, I think, a regular 3-mile run, right? Not with the full rock and everything. Okay, so this is a regular 3-mile run times. And here we did start to see something. The drops were still okay. This is, again, another common standard in which they're failed or kept in for. But the safeties really were less fit. So that tells me the instructors kind of know what they're doing. They really were the guys that didn't make it for safety. And if you're not as fit, maybe you're not safe in these kinds of environments. And that came out again on the more rigorous hike they did, which was 5 miles with a full 35-pound backpack and full uniform, camis, et cetera. So that's much more rigorous. And there the safeties really showed themselves as not as fit, but the drops, which were the majority, were still hanging in there. So let's look at what we collected. And I'm sorry this is a little tough to look at, but it's pretty interesting. First of all, I don't think anybody's done this with a wearable. We are actually able, over a month, to collect like every heartbeat of these guys and every amount of steps that they took. So you can see on the left upper, this is the passes over the entirety of time. And they're, 10, 20, they're 1,000 steps, they're doing 5, 10, 15 miles a day equivalent. And the lower one on the left is the actual drops. And what you see there is most of them are gone by 6 days. So we blew that up, and that's the stuff on the right. And if you look at the step data, what's clear here is that the drops, which occur by day 6 on the bottom, they are never really physically tested to the level that the guys who stayed in are. So they're not putting out as much in that early part of the course. So it makes sense that they seem as physically fit. We're not really challenging them. It doesn't feel like they're DORing for that reason. And while in general, the guys who passed did more, if you just look at step counts, it's because they stayed in longer. But if you look at the peak that most of the drops got to, they really, again, 4 or 5 miles a day, 1 10-mile hike, nothing like what the other guys endured. So heart rate, we're able to get continuous heart rate. This is a first. I think this is amazing. We're going to be looking at this for a long time. If you look at the first part of the graph in the people that passed, you can see they're sleeping, they're exercising, they're getting trained. These guys are hitting heart rates of 200 quite a bit over 25 days. But if you look at the bottom one, and again, you look at the drops, they are a little less robust in that regard, I think, because they're not seeing the work. Now, one of the things we were very curious about is if these guys look differently at night, if they weren't sleeping, that type of thing. And it turns out that at night, their heart rates, those are the passes, the drops, they weren't that much different, the drops from the passes. It wasn't like they were, really upset at night. They had high heart rates. And I think because they were stressed and working hard in these first 6 days, they all slept really good. And their heart rates got low. They had great circadian rhythm. They're pretty healthy guys. Sleep was not a thing. I think they were hitting the bed and they were falling asleep. What about their personality traits? So this was interesting because there's a lot of Army and other literature that suggests that certain personality traits like grit predict success in military training. And what we found actually was that the predictive traits were less neuroticism, more positive affect, and less anxiety. And things like ego resilience, grit, and stress immunity didn't appear to be predictive. And again, we'll have to validate this across our larger cohort. The other thing is that was interesting is you kind of watch these guys and you think, are these different from most of America? Because this is pretty intense. And it turns out that the great thing about doing these surveys is this kind of was America. These guys were no different from age-matched guys in community college because those normative values are there. So the substrate they're getting is kind of America. But this is interesting. Moni, do you want to say something about it?
I think you covered it pretty well. But yeah, that's why we had included those ego resilience and grit scales, because we thought it'd be a way to tease out the passes and the fails, especially in the Marines. So we were pretty surprised by the findings. And most in particular, I think the positive affect, and anxiety, that's understandable, stress immunity, but positive affect, I think in particular, is really interesting.
And if we get into this a little bit more with behavior, I think this is pretty interesting data. So now we're going to focus on just the days where we got most of the drops, the first 6 days. Remember, this is somebody's whole life dreams. It's all going bad within 6 days, right? So if you look at the passes versus the drops, pretty early on for doing the same thing, the drops are feeling it more, right? Every day they're filling out these surveys. They know nobody sees them but us, and they're confidential. They're feeling more physical pain, right? They're not even working as hard, actually, but if you look at their heart rate and how much they're feeling. So 5 is good. 5 is not much emotional pain. They're also feeling more emotional pain. And by day 2, you're getting a pretty good signal that this guy's heading south on quitting on himself potentially, or that concept. The other kind of interesting thing is, and everybody thinks about quitting, but the guys that pass think about quitting less, and it's not as pervasive every day, every time you ask them. Confidence that they're going to be successful in completing the course. Again, everybody has some doubts because it's really hard, but the drops have more doubts, and then right before they drop, there's a signal. So the food and the sleep, again, maybe because they're young and you can almost do anything to somebody who's young and healthy, but it didn't predict anything. That looked like they drank and they actually got enough calories where, at least within the time frame we're looking at, it wasn't predictive. So we would say it's possible to accurately track continuous measures of mental and physical performance in reconnaissance trainees during high-risk outdoor austere training. There isn't a lot of wireless and everything else at Pendleton, but Brooks was able to make it work. And we look forward to working with Apple and others to evolve our processes here and fully leverage the technologies. Drop training failures display more psychological behavioral differences than physical differences from successful trainees, because they weren't even tested at anywhere near that level. Safety drops appear to be less physically fit. It's pretty clear that the instructors are doing a good job there. Successful trainees, despite significant physical strain, because there was a huge load on them at the end of 25 days, remain optimistic throughout their training. And remember, at the end of that 25 days, they're going to go into the real work, which is the next 60. So thank you.